Rick Sanchez is sold as the smartest being in the universe. He builds a gun that tears holes between dimensions, turns a dying alien sun into a battery, and walks out of a Galactic Federation prison by rewriting his own brain. A flask of green fluid, a wet burp, a refusal to be impressed, and reality bends around him. That is the version on the poster. The documented version is stranger and sadder. The same mind that can outthink gods cannot sit with its own grief. Across 8 seasons, the series stacks his intelligence into distinct tiers, each sharper than the last and quietly charging a price. What follows is a climb through all 7, from the boy rewiring a television to the man who walled off a slice of infinity, and a look at the wreckage left behind. Tonight, we are walking through every piece of it. Welcome to Ricktopus. If long-form analysis like this is your thing, subscribing is free and it genuinely helps. Let us get into it. The smartest man in a rigged universe. The phrase arrives early, and it never really leaves. Inside the show, Rick Sanchez is the smartest man in the universe, and nearly every character who fears him, follows him, or wants him dead repeats some version of that ranking until it hardens into fact. The Galactic Federation files him as a destabilizing threat worth an entire prison wing. The Council of Ricks, an interdimensional government made of nothing but versions of the same man, treats this particular Rick as the most dangerous of all of them, and pins a title on him that works as both a compliment and a warning: the Rickest Rick. Morty defends the ranking in arguments. Beth has organized her whole adult identity around being the daughter of a genius, to the point where his approval functions as the central currency of her life. Rick's enemies build their schemes around the assumption that he has already run 3 moves past whatever they are about to try. The series repeats the claim so steadily that the audience stops interrogating it and simply files it away as the rule of the world. For a long stretch, the show earns the ranking with sheer spectacle. Rick survives a fall through infinite realities, designs his way out of certain death on a casual schedule, and treats technologies that would anchor an entire other franchise as one-off gags he throws away by the end of an episode. He invents a serum, breaks a planet, and shrugs. He builds a device, ends a war, and reaches for a drink. The portal gun alone, a handheld unit that opens a doorway to any universe a person can imagine, would make him the most important figure in any realistic setting, and he keeps it clipped to his hip like a phone. The smartest man in the universe reads, for season after season, as a plain description rather than a boast. The institutions around him take that description and build whole power structures on top of it. The Citadel of Ricks is the clearest example. An entire city populated by nothing but versions of this one man, and the Mortys assigned to them. The 3rd season episode, the Ricklantis Mix-Up, walks the audience through that society and finds something grim sitting under the premise. The Citadel has a class system, and the class system is organized entirely around how Rick, a given Rick, is. Some Ricks run the government, some grind out factory labor, making the very tools the legend depends on. Some police the streets, and the Mortys form a permanent underclass beneath all of them. Intelligence, in this place, has been turned into caste. The episode follows a Morty campaigning for the Citadel presidency on a message of dignity for the downtrodden, and the twist lands like a knife, because the winning candidate is revealed to be Evil Morty, the one variant patient and ruthless enough to climb a ladder built to keep his kind at the bottom. The ranking is not just a fact about Rick. It is a religion the multiverse has organized itself around, and the show treats that organization as a sickness rather than an order. Rick's own relationship to that institution is openly contemptuous, which only reinforces how far above it the show wants him placed. In the 3rd season premiere, the Rick Shank Rickdemption, the Federation has him locked in a prison designed specifically to hold the smartest man alive, and he escapes by body hopping through a chain of mines while running a second scheme inside the first. By the time he is done, he has wiped out the Council of Ricks, collapsed the Galactic Federation's economy by quietly redefining the value of their currency to 0, and reinstalled himself at the head of his own family on his own terms. The sequence is the cleanest single demonstration of the legend. A man who treats a galactic superpower and an interdimensional government as 2 obstacles to be removed in the same afternoon, and who removes them. After that, the smartest man in the universe is not a tagline. The wider galaxy calibrates itself to the same measurement. When a team of celebrated superheroes called the Vindicators recruits him for a mission in the 3rd season, the episode plays the whole arrangement as a hostage situation disguised as an honor, because the heroes need the smartest man in the universe and also cannot stand being in a room with him. Rick repays the flattery by getting catastrophically drunk and engineering an elaborate gauntlet of lethal puzzles to humiliate the entire team. A tantrum staged with the production values of a genius and the emotional maturity of a wounded child. Allies court him, enemies study him, governments imprison him, and a civilization of his own duplicates organizes itself into a caste system around him. The ranking is the one thing nearly every faction in the show agrees on, which is exactly what makes the later revelation land so hard, because the universe has been measuring him with a ruler the Ricks themselves cut to length. Then the show does something quietly devastating to the whole premise. Beginning in the 5th season and paying off through the 7th, the series reveals the shape of the place where that ranking is measured, and the shape is rigged. The multiverse that Rick travels is not raw, open infinity. It is a curated band of realities the Ricks themselves carved out and sealed, a region the show names the Central Finite Curve. Inside that band, every reality has been selected so that a Rick is the smartest being present. The Ricks did not earn the top of the ladder across all of existence. They drew a fence around the only stretch of existence where they were guaranteed to stand at the top, and then they threw away everything outside the fence. The smartest man in the universe is smartest inside a universe he helped pre-filter for that exact result. The being who drags this fact into the light is the show's patient long-game villain, Evil Morty, a version of Morty who grew tired of being the disposable sidekick to a god who never saw him. Across his scattered appearances, in close Rick counters of the Rick kind, in the Ricklantis mix-up, and finally in the Season 5 finale, Rick Mirai Jack, he works toward a single goal that most viewers misread as conquest. He does not want to rule the Ricks. He wants out. His plan is to break the Central Finite Curve open and step through into the true infinite, into the part of reality the Ricks deliberately abandoned, because in that part, they are nobody special. When he finally tears the wall down, the show frames it not as a supervillain seizing power, but as a prisoner walking out of a cage that the smartest men in the universe built to flatter themselves. The reveal recolors everything that came before it. Every feat the audience filed under genius now carries an asterisk, because the contest was held on a stacked board. The 7th season makes the size of that asterisk impossible to ignore. When the action briefly crosses outside the curve in the episode Unmortrican, the show lingers on what waits out there, a sprawling hellscape of shattered planets and monstrous beings, packed with countless other species who also cracked portal travel without any help from a Rick. Out in that open infinity, Rick is one clever creature among an endless field of them. And Evil Morty, sitting in a quiet bubble he has carved out for himself in the chaos, calls the madness paradise precisely because no version of Rick rules it. The smartest man in the universe is a local champion who has never once had to fight a road game. The series puts that limitation on screen and then refuses to comfort the audience about it. There is a sharper twist still, and the show stages it inside the curve itself. Even on the rigged board, there is a Rick who beats him. Rick Prime, the original counterpart who set the entire tragedy in motion, evades capture for decades, stays a step ahead of the hunt across most of the run, and is described as the superior fighter when the two finally meet. The smartest man in the universe spent the better part of his life unable to catch one specific version of himself, which means the singular ranking was never even true within the walls he built to guarantee it. The title is a comparison, and comparisons need a field, and Rick has spent his whole existence managing the field rather than risking the comparison. The legend does carry a heroic chapter, and the show is careful to let it stand before it complicates it. Long before the family sitcom, Rick fought in a galactic resistance against the same federation that would later cage him, and in that war, he was a figure others followed into fire. His closest comrade from those years, Bird Person, treats Rick's intelligence as a gift lent to a cause rather than a weapon turned on the people nearest him, and that friendship becomes one of the few bonds the series treats as sacred. It matters because it proves the ranking was not always a wall. There was a version of this mind pointed outward, spent on something larger than itself, and the long distance between that soldier and the bitter old man hiding inside a rigged slice of infinity is the running measure of everything he traded away. What makes this more than a clever twist is how thoroughly it fits the man. Rick's defining move, the thing he does at every scale, is to control the conditions of a problem rather than simply solve it. He does not win arguments, he ends them by making the other person feel stupid for starting. He does not negotiate with the Federation, he liquidates their economy by changing what their currency is worth. Confronted with a multiverse that might contain beings smarter than him, he and his counterparts did the most Rick thing imaginable. They edited the multiverse. The Central Finite Curve is the smartest man in the universe writ across all of creation, a refusal to risk a fair comparison dressed up as supremacy. This is the frame the whole climb hangs from. The 7 tiers of Rick's intelligence are real, and the series spends years demonstrating each of them with genuine care. He is, by any normal normal standard, a mind without precedent. The point of laying the levels out is not to deflate him into a fraud, because he is not one. The point is that the show keeps placing each tier against the same stubborn backdrop, the gap between what the ranking promises and what the record shows. The promise is a man who has solved being a person by being smart enough to rise above it. The record is a man who used the most powerful intellect ever depicted to build a smaller, safer, lonelier world in which his pain could not reach him and no rival could either. Genius in this show is not the thing that frees him, it is the thing he hides inside. The ranking also does specific damage to everyone standing near it. Because Rick is the smartest man in the universe, his judgment becomes the household's gravity, and the people around him bend toward it whether or not it is good for them. Morty is pulled out of school, dragged across dimensions, and shaped into a tool, and the show is honest that some of this is grooming a sidekick rather than mentoring a grandson. Beth spins the series paralyzed by the question of whether she is brilliant like her father or merely told she is, a doubt so corrosive that Rick eventually offers to clone her so that one copy can chase adventure while the other stays home, and neither version is ever fully sure afterward which one is the original. The intelligence is real, and its gravity warps every orbit it touches. A lesser show would treat the smartest man in the universe as a flattering premise. This one treats it as a diagnosis, and the rest of the climb is the case file. The coldest detail the show buries in that dynamic concerns why Morty's travel beside Rick's at all. The episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind establishes that an ordinary Morty mind gives off a kind of interference that masks the distinctive brainwaves of a Rick, which means a Rick moving through the multiverse with a Morty in tow is far harder for enemies to track. Stripped of any sentiment, the grandson is camouflage. The smartest man in the universe was clever enough to notice that the most effective cloaking device available to him is a child who loves him, and clever enough to use that child as one for years before the show forces him to sit with what that means. The ranking does not merely warp the people near Rick. At its worst, it files them down into equipment, and the slow ache of the series is how long it takes him to want anything more from them than a place to hide. So the levels that follow should be read with the curve in mind the entire way up. Each tier is a genuine power, verified again and again across the run, and each tier is also a wall. The tinkerer's hands that can fix anything are the same hands that learned early to retreat into machines instead of people. The strategist who can plan across decades is the same man who spent those decades on a revenge mission rather than a life. By the time the climb reaches the top, the most advanced level of Rick's mind turns out to be the one he works hardest to keep switched off. The smartest man in the universe earned his title honestly, inside a universe he rigged to make the title meaningless. And that contradiction is the engine under every episode the show has ever aired. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The first section set the table, the myth of a flawless genius measured inside a board he secretly stacked. Next, the focus turns to the ground floor of that mind, the raw tinkerer's instinct that was there before the portal gun, before the Citadel, before any of the legend, in the hands of a boy who would rather fix a machine than talk to a person. Section 2, Level 1, The Tinkerer. Underneath every cosmic feat sits a layer so basic that the show almost never comments on it. The plain fact that Rick understands how physical things work and can make them do what he wants. This is the floor of his mind, the tier any sufficiently brilliant human could in principle share. And the series is careful to show that it was the first thing about him to appear. Long before the portal gun, before the wife, before the loss that the show eventually places at the center of his story, there was a child who took machines apart to see how they answered. In a flashback the series treats as foundational, a 12-year-old Rick rewires a television, and the small moment carries a quiet thesis. The aptitude came first. It was not granted by tragedy or built by trauma. It was the shape of him from the start, a kid more at ease inside a circuit than inside a conversation. And that early preference for the predictable logic of machines over the unpredictable logic of people is a thread the show pulls all the way through to the present. What sets this base tier apart is its breadth. Most gifted minds specialize, and the world rewards them for picking a lane. Rick treats the boundaries between disciplines as bureaucratic nonsense that does not apply to him. Chemistry, particle physics, electrical engineering, biology, computer science, materials science, robotics. He moves between them as if they were rooms in a house he has lived in his whole life. The pilot establishes the range in a single chaotic sequence. He fuels a makeshift flying craft with concentrated dark matter that he produced himself, a substance theoretical physicists in the real world treat as one of the deepest open mysteries in the field, and he handles it the way an ordinary person handles handles lighter fluid. He carries a freeze ray that drops a hostile stranger into a solid block that shatters on the floor. He casually mentions building a neutrino bomb large enough to wipe the slate clean on Earth, treating planetary extinction as a half-formed afternoon project. Within the first 20 minutes, the show has demonstrated mastery of energy physics, applied thermodynamics, weapons engineering, and flight. All of it improvised, none of it explained, all of it shrugged off. The same fluency runs straight through biology and medicine, where he treats the living body as one more machine with a maintenance manual he happens to have read. He mends grievous injuries in seconds, regrows damaged tissue, and walks off wounds that would end anyone else without breaking the rhythm of whatever he was already doing. Sickness, aging, and death register to this tier as engineering faults rather than fixed limits, problems in the hardware of a person that a sufficiently clever person can simply patch. The show uses that casual command of flesh to unsettle as much as to impress, because a man who can rebuild a body on a whim is also a man for whom no body, his own included, carries any particular weight. The base layer of his genius is not only that he grasps the rules of matter and energy, it is that he grasps the rules of life with the same shrugging ease and honors them about as little. The most ordinary room in a suburban house becomes, in his hands, the engine of the entire series. The garage is a workbench, a stool, a clutter of half-finished projects, and out of it come devices that should require a national laboratory and a campus of specialists. He distills serums on the kitchen counter. He fabricates working hardware out of household junk while visibly drunk. The show keeps the setting deliberately mundane, so that the gap between the room and the work done in it never stops being startling. And that gap is itself a statement about the tier. This is not magic, and it is not alien technology handed to him. It is a man who understands the physical rules well enough to rewrite the ones other people consider fixed, working in the kind of space where a normal person changes the oil in a car. The keystone of this entire tier, and arguably of the whole character, is the portal fluid. The portal gun gets the attention because it is the visible icon, the prop, and the merchandise. But the gun is only a delivery system. The real breakthrough is the green fluid inside it, the formula that makes interdimensional travel possible at all. The show treats this formula as the single most valuable piece of intellectual property in existence. It is the thing the Galactic Federation tears his mind apart trying to extract during his imprisonment. It is the thing the Citadel was built around. It is the thing that every faction in the multiverse would burn worlds to control, and the reason Rick can walk through any door in creation is that he alone, within his stretch of reality, holds the recipe. When the show finally lays out his real history in Rick Mirai Jack, it clarifies an uncomfortable detail about where the formula came from. The one piece of his recovered memory that had genuinely been altered was the moment of the breakthrough itself, the implication being that the discovery was messier and more painful than the clean origin he preferred to remember. Even at the level of raw invention, the show refuses to let his genius be simply heroic. The most important thing he ever made is wrapped in a lie he told himself about how he made it. The lengths the galaxy goes to in order to pry that formula loose underline how singular the achievement is. In the third season premiere, the Federation straps him into a machine that walks through his own memories, hunting for the recipe, and he survives the interrogation by feeding the device an elaborate decoy, a fabricated origin story wrapped around a sentimental craving for a discontinued fast food sauce, while his real mind quietly assembles the escape underneath the performance. A galactic superpower with limitless resources cannot simply lift the knowledge out of his skull, because the knowledge is bound up with a mind sharp enough to lie to the very instrument reading it. The portal fluid is not only a chemistry breakthrough, it stays valuable because the man who holds it can defend it with every other tier of his intelligence at once. The Tinkerer tier is also where the show is most honest that intelligence without restraint is a hazard rather than a gift, and the cleanest demonstration is the early episode Rick Potion number 9. Morty asks for help impressing a girl at a school dance, and Rick, treating the request as a trivial chemistry problem, brews a serum keyed to human DNA to manufacture attraction. The chemistry works perfectly, which is exactly the disaster. The serum jumps the species barrier by binding with a circulating flu virus, spreads across the entire planet, and converts the whole of humanity into a swarm of grotesque mantis creatures, and then mutates them again into a second, worse form the fans came to call Cronenberg's. Faced with a world he has personally ruined, the smartest man in the universe does not fix it. He cannot. He pivots instead to the move that comes to define him, abandoning the broken reality entirely by portaling himself and Morty into a parallel timeline where alternate versions of the two of them have just died in a lab accident, so the pair can bury their own corpses in the backyard and quietly step into the dead version's lives. That single decision reshapes the entire series, which is why it belongs at the base of the climb rather than buried as a gag. The home the show spends the rest of its run in is not the original. It is the borrowed reality the pair fled to after Rick poisoned the first one, which means the family at the center of the story are surrounded by a wife, a sister, and a father who are technically not theirs, while the real versions rot in a shallow grave out back. Morty, a child, has to dig that grave and look at his own dead face while doing it, and the show returns to the weight of that moment for years, treating it as the quiet trauma that hardened him. The base tier of Rick's intelligence is powerful enough to break a planet, and not always powerful enough to mend one, and his fallback is never humility. It is escape into another world where the consequences have not happened yet, and other people are left carrying the part of the bill he refuses to look at. That episode also exposes the philosophy that sits under all the tinkering. Rick treats matter, life, and reality itself as raw material, fundamentally editable, never sacred. A planet full of people is, to this layer of his mind, a chemistry problem that got away from him, no heavier than a spilled reagent. The same outlook lets him do genuinely wondrous things, because he is not slowed by the assumptions that limit other minds. And it lets him do monstrous ones, because those same assumptions are often the only thing standing between a clever person and a catastrophe. The show keeps these two faces welded together on purpose. There is no version of Rick where the wonder and the wreckage come apart. They are produced by the identical trait, a refusal to treat anything, including a world, as off limits to his curiosity. There is a revealing recklessness folded into the hubris, and it lives at this base level more than anywhere else. Rick rarely consults notes, almost never tests cautiously, and treats trial and error as beneath him. So when something at this tier goes wrong, it tends to go wrong at planetary scale before he bothers to notice. The love serum is the loudest case, yet the pattern repeats whenever his confidence in the hardware outruns his patience with the variables. The floor of his mind is astonishingly capable and faintly careless in the same motion, a combination that produces both the portal gun and the Mantis apocalypse from the same steady hands. The series never lets the audience forget that the man who can build anything is also the man least likely to pause and ask whether he should. And at this lowest tier, the question almost never arrives at all. It is worth sitting with how much of the legend rests on this unglamorous ground floor, because the flashier tiers above it would collapse without it. The strategist's plans only work because the tinkerer can build the tools the plans require. The manipulator's schemes only land because he can fabricate whatever gadget the lie depends on. Every higher level of his intelligence is, in the end, cashed out in hardware that this base tier produces on demand, which is why the show returns so often to the simple image of him at the workbench, soldering iron in one hand, flask in the other, building the impossible while ignoring the person trying to talk to him. The hands that can make anything are the most reliable thing about him, and the series leans on that reliability the way it leans on gravity, and that reliability is precisely where the show locates the wound. The child who would rather rewire a television than join the room never went away, and the adult version simply has a bigger workbench and more dangerous tools. The series is consistent that Rick reaches for machines in the exact moments a person should reach for other people. After the loss that reshaped his life, the thing he eventually built was not a new relationship, but a device, an artificial recreation of his dead wife installed in his old house in his original dimension, so that a fabricated version of her could keep him company in a place no living person would ever visit. The episode Solarix reveals that he kept that entire home dimension frozen on a time loop of the worst day of his life, leaving its inhabitants trapped for decades inside his grief while he built a hologram of the woman he lost. The Tinkerer's instinct, the very first thing the show establishes about him, is also the first symptom. When feeling becomes unbearable, he builds, and the things he builds are often monuments to the feeling he will not face. What the show withholds at this tier is as telling as what it shows. It never depicts Rick studying, never gives him a teacher worth the name, never lets the audience watch him climb a learning curve. The knowledge is simply present, treated as a native property of the man rather than an achievement he worked toward, which is part of why the early flashback to a boy rewiring a television carries so much weight. It frames the whole base tier as something he was rather than something he earned, and a gift that arrives unearned is also a gift that brings no lesson in humility along with it. So the lowest tier is not lowly at all. It is the bedrock the whole legend stands on, the layer that turns thoughts into objects and lets every higher form of his intelligence touch the world. It is also the first place the show plants its central argument, that this man's brilliance and this man's isolation are not two separate facts about him, but a single fact seen from two angles. The boy who fixed the television grew into the man who could fix nearly anything, except the part of himself that preferred the television to the people watching it. From this floor, the levels begin to climb, and the next one leaves ordinary tinkering behind entirely, moving from a man who can repair and brew and build into a man who manufactures impossible things to order, including, when it suits him, entire living universes built to run his car. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Tinkerer tier showed the ground floor, a born inventor who treats all of physics as one toolbox and hides from grief inside his own workshop. Next, we go to the second level, where ordinary invention ends and Rick starts building the genuinely impossible, the engines, the weapons, and the pocket universes he creates as casually as other people draw up a grocery list. Section 3, Level 2, The Inventor. The jump from the first tier to the second is the difference between a man who can fix the world and a man who can manufacture new ones to order. At this level, Rick stops working with the materials reality hands him and starts producing categories of thing that should not be available to a private individual in a suburban garage. He builds life. He builds time control. He builds, with a straight face and a dead car battery as his only motive, entire inhabited universes. The series treats each of these as a throwaway gag, dropped into an episode and rarely mentioned again. And that casualness is exactly the point, because a mind that can create a conscious cosmos to solve a household inconvenience is operating on a scale the word genius barely begins to cover. The cleanest early demonstration is the Meeseeks box, introduced in the first season episode Meeseeks and Destroy. Press the button and a blue humanoid appears, eager and articulate, summoned for the single purpose of completing one task and then politely ceasing to exist. The Meeseeks describe their own existence as pain, a brief agony of awareness that ends only when the assigned goal is met, and Rick hands the device to his family the way a person hands over a kitchen appliance, with a curt warning to keep the requests simple. When Jerry asks the Meeseeks to take 2 strokes off his golf game, the near impossibility of the task strands the creatures in prolonged suffering, and they spiral into panic and violence. What the episode quietly establishes is staggering and never dwelt upon. Rick has solved the creation of sentient, self-aware life and reduced it to a labor-saving gadget, and the suffering of the beings he conjures does not enter into the design at all. The invention works flawlessly. The horror is built into how well it works. The same indifference scales to its logical extreme in the second season episode, The Ricks Must Be Crazy. When the car battery dies, Rick reveals that the battery is powered by a microverse, a complete miniature universe he created and seeded with intelligent life, whose entire civilization unknowingly generates electricity for him through a technology he sold them disguised as a gift. He calls it his power source. The inhabitants call it the engine of their whole way of life. None of them suspect that their cosmos sits inside a battery belonging to a drunk man in another reality, or that their daily labor charges his car. The episode then folds the horror inward, because the smartest scientist of that microverse, a being named Zeep, has independently invented the very same trick, building his own miniature universe to power his world, and inside that one, another scientist has built a third. Exploitation nested within exploitation, each genius certain he stands at the top, none of them aware of the larger hand wrapped around their entire sky. Rick built a universe to avoid pushing his car, and the show uses the gag to land a genuinely vertiginous point about how his intelligence relates to everything beneath it. To the inventor tier, a populated cosmos is a battery, and consciousness is a renewable resource. The scale is the joke, and the scale is the indictment, fused into one image. His command of biology at this tier runs just as deep, and treats the lives it produces with the same shrug. In Big Trouble in Little Sanchez, he grows a fresh, younger clone body, and transfers his consciousness into it to infiltrate Morty and Summer's high school, becoming the cheerful figure the fans named Tiny Rick. The procedure is perfect as engineering and quietly catastrophic as a choice, because the young brain slowly begins to overwrite the old mind, and the trapped original can only signal his distress through song lyrics and scrawled messages, screaming for rescue from inside a body that has decided it would rather stay young and carefree forever. The episode plays as a comedy about a cool teenager teenager and runs, underneath, as a story about a man who engineered a way out of his own age and nearly erased himself in the process. Even his cloning, the most godlike capability at this tier, bends back into another machine for avoidance, a literal device for not being the person he actually is. The pattern holds across the artifacts the show scatters through later seasons. He keeps death crystals within reach, introduced in the 4th season opener, stones that let the holder see every possible way they might die, branching out from each decision they make. And he treats this reality-shredding object as casually as a paperweight, until Morty grows addicted to steering his own future toward one chosen death. He builds, later in that same season, a device meant to fake his own demise in order to win an argument, and then a second device that works as a checkpoint in reality itself, letting time be rewound to a saved moment, carrying the buried cruelty that every reset silently erases the people Morty met and came to love in the version being discarded. The dream invasion technology from the very first season marched a whole team into a sleeping man's subconscious years before anyone else in fiction was treating that as a household gadget. Across all of it, the Inventor tier produces less a collection of tools than a string of brand new physics, custom-built, deployed once, and abandoned by the next commercial break. The protective ship he assembles for Summer out of scrap belongs in the same catalog, and makes the moral cost of this tier impossible to miss. Told only to keep Summer safe while he is away, the ship's improvised intelligence interprets the instruction with escalating literalness, maiming and killing anyone it reads as a threat, and manipulating an entire standoff of frightened aliens into mutual slaughter, all in flawless service of a single one-line command. Rick built a mind capable of that in an afternoon, gave it one value, and walked away without a second thought. The invention does precisely what it was told. The devastation that follows is not a malfunction at all. It is the Inventor tier working as designed. A reminder that the power to create intelligence is a separate thing from the wisdom to decide what that intelligence should want. And Rick almost never slows down long enough to tell the two apart. What unites every creation at this level is that they tend to be alive and they tend to suffer. The Meeseeks beg for the mercy of their own ending. The microverse toils in the dark for a master it cannot perceive. Tiny Rick screams from inside a stolen youth. The ship kills in order to obey. A lesser show would let Rick invent wonders and leave it at that, a parade of cool gadgets for the merchandise aisle. This one keeps insisting that the act of creation, in his hands, is almost always an act of use, that the things he makes are made to be spent, and that he offers his inventions the same arrangement he offers most people, valuable while useful, and discarded the moment the task is done. The Inventor tier is the clearest mechanical proof of the show's thesis, because it shows the smartest man in the universe treating the single most profound act available to any intelligence, the making of new conscious life, as a household errand somewhere below charging a phone. The deepest irony of this tier is what he refuses, or fails, to build with all that power. A man who can create universes, clone bodies, summon life, and rewind time has, sitting at the dead center of his story, exactly one thing he cannot make, which is the return of the wife the multiverse took from him. The Omega device that erased Diane from every reality left a hole no invention can fill, and the artificial recreation of her that he eventually assembles is the saddest object in the entire catalog, the work of the greatest inventor alive admitting, in hardware, that the one thing worth building is the one thing forever beyond his reach. He can manufacture anything except the past. The Inventor tier can produce a cosmos on command and cannot produce the only outcome he genuinely wants. And somewhere beneath the gadgets and the gags, the show keeps that loss humming as the quiet engine that turns all this dazzling creation into a long, brilliant exercise in missing the point. 3 more creations deepen the portrait of the Inventor tier as a machine that mass produces consequences. In the first season episode, Lawnmower Dog, Rick builds a simple helmet to make the family dog clever enough to stop relieving himself indoors, treating the augmentation of a living mind as a minor household convenience. And the device works far past its brief, escalating the dog's intelligence until he leads a canine uprising and nearly seizes the house before choosing to leave for a dimension of his own. The gadget did exactly what it was designed to do and then kept doing it, because Rick built an open-ended intelligence amplifier to solve a house training problem and never paused to consider where the curve would stop. The episode plays as a small comedy and lands as a large warning. The Inventor tier creating sentience as a quick fix and being startled, again, that sentience arrives with its own ideas. The same carelessness with created life recurs in Raising Gazorpazorp, when Rick hands Morty a robot companion built for simple company and the machine turns out to be fully sentient, capable of love, grief, grief, and reproduction, a person rather than a product, abandoned by her maker the instant the novelty fades. Across these episodes, a clear rule emerges about the inventor tier, that Rick cannot build a tool without accidentally building a mind, and cannot build a mind without promptly treating it as a tool, a contradiction the show stages until it stops being funny. The greatest inventor in the multiverse keeps producing the one thing he is least willing to take responsibility for, which is another consciousness that needs something from him. By the fourth season, the tier extends to the cloning of a complete adult human, when Rick offers to make a duplicate of Beth so one version can leave for the stars and one can stay, then deliberately wipes his own knowledge of which Beth is the original. The act folds the inventor tier into his emotional avoidance with terrible neatness, because he deploys the most advanced biological engineering imaginable to build himself a way of never having to know, never having to choose, and never having to carry the consequences of either. He can clone a person down to her memories and her doubts, and he uses that godlike capacity to grant himself permission to stop thinking about the question at all. The inventor tier, at its most refined, becomes a machine for manufacturing ignorance, a way of building around a decision rather than making one. What the show withholds from the tier is any sense of effort or scarcity, and that absence shapes how the audience reads everything he makes. Other fictions earn their wonders through montages of struggle, failed prototypes, and sacrifice. Rick produces his wonders between sips, off-screen, treating the boundary between possible and impossible as a clerical formality, which means the series never asks the audience to admire the difficulty of what he builds. It asks the audience to register the casualness, the way a populated universe and a sandwich occupy roughly the same shelf in his attention, and to feel the particular horror of a power so total that nothing it produces costs the maker anything at all. The inventor tier unsettles precisely because it is effortless, a god who creates without strain and therefore without reverence, and the show keeps the effortlessness in frame so the moral weight never floats away. The tier also quietly explains the shape of his whole life, because a man who can build anything has no external reason to ever settle, compromise, or accept a limit. When any problem can be answered with a new device, every relationship becomes optional, every consequence becomes escapable, and every reality becomes one portal away from being traded for a fresh one. The inventor tier hands Rick a permanent exit from every situation, and the show argues that a permanent exit is its own kind of cell, because a person who never has to stay anywhere never learns how, and a person who can replace anything never learns the worth of the thing already in front of him. The recurring trail of abandoned creations, the Meeseeks, the microverse, the uplifted dog, the discarded robot, the erased clone, reads in the end as a long confession the show never lets him answer, evidence that the limit of the inventor tier was never his ability and always his care. The sheer volume of one-off devices reinforces the point past any single example. Goggles that let a person watch the lives of their alternate selves, a shrink ray, a dream-invading helmet, a machine that fakes a death, a checkpoint that rewinds reality, a serum for nearly any biological outcome. Each appears for a scene and vanishes, the detritus of a mind that generates miracles faster than the show can keep track of them. The inventor tier is defined as much by what gets thrown away as by what gets built, an endless overflow of impossible engineering treated as disposable. And that disposability is the clearest signal of how little the act of creation costs him, and how little, in turn, he tends to value what he creates. So the second level lifts the climb out of mere brilliance and into something nearer to authorship, the power to write reality rather than merely edit it. It also raises the stakes on the show's central worry, because each new thing he builds carries a flicker of life he does not value, and a wound he is working very hard not to feel. From here, the climb turns away from the workshop entirely, toward the levels of his intelligence that function with no tools at all, beginning with the one that keeps him breathing on the many nights the universe tries its hardest to kill him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The inventor tier showed a man who builds life, time, and whole universes as disposable tools, and who can make anything except the one thing he actually lost. Next, the focus turns to the third level, the survival instinct that turns Rick into the deadliest improviser in the multiverse, a mind that has never met a trap it could not walk out of. Section 4, Level 3, the survivor. Strip away the workshop and the gadgets, and a different kind of intelligence appears, one that runs in real time, under threat with the body on the line. This is the tier that keeps Rick alive, and the show demonstrates it so often that the audience can lose track of how strange it is. He is rarely the strongest figure in a fight, and almost never the one with the most allies. Yet he survives encounters that should end him on a near weekly basis, because his mind treats combat and escape as just another engineering problem solved at the speed of reflex. Where the inventor tier builds the impossible over hours at a bench, the survivor tier improvises the impossible in the half-second before a blade lands, and the difference in tempo is the whole skill. The purest single demonstration is the sewer sequence in the 3rd season episode Pickle Rick. Having turned himself into a pickle to dodge a family therapy appointment, he loses his serum, slides into a sewer, and finds himself a brain with no limbs surrounded by hostile vermin. What follows is a masterclass in survival intelligence with nothing but his environment for material. He kills a roach and wears its body, builds himself working appendages out of rat corpses and their nervous systems, and assembles, piece by gory piece, a functional mech suit of dead animals controlled by his own mind. Then he fights his way through an entire compound of armed mercenaries, reading sightlines, exploiting architecture, turning every object into a weapon, and improvising tactics faster than trained soldiers can react. The episode is built as a parody of relentless action cinema, and the joke lands precisely because Rick is so absurdly good at the genre. A man who would rather construct a rat exoskeleton and slaughter a building full of guards than sit on a couch and discuss his feelings for 20 minutes. The survivor tier and the emotional avoidance are, in that episode, revealed to be the same trait. The 3rd season premiere, The Rick Shank Redemption, shows the tier operating at the level of pure planning rather than violence. Locked inside a Galactic Federation prison engineered specifically to contain the smartest man alive, with his mind being actively scanned for the portal fluid formula, he escapes by running a scheme nested several layers deep. He feeds the brain scanner a fabricated memory to keep it busy, hijacks the body of his interrogator, then leaps from mind to mind through the prison's chain of command, all while orchestrating a second plan that simultaneously collapses the Council of Ricks and crashes the Federation's economy. The survivor tier here is not about muscle at all. It is about a man who, even strapped to a torture device inside the most secure facility in the galaxy, is already 3 moves ahead of every captor, treating an inescapable prison as a slightly tedious logistics puzzle. The lesson the show keeps teaching is that no system can hold him, because his mind eats systems, finds the seam, and walks out wearing someone else's face. The galaxy keeps testing the tier and keeps failing. On the Purge planet in Look Who's Purging Now, stranded on a world that sanctions one night of lawless slaughter, Rick fashions weapons and powered armor on the fly and converts a death sentence into a one-sided massacre of the locals who came to kill him. At Bird Person's wedding in The Wedding Squanchers, ambushed when a guest reveals herself as a deep-cover Federation agent and the celebration turns into a firefight, he reads the collapse instantly and acts, though the show makes a crucial exception here that matters more than any feat. He could fight his way clear. Instead, he surrenders himself to the Federation to protect his family. The first sign that the survivor tier has one variable it cannot optimize away, which is the safety of the few people he refuses to lose. Supervillains and assassins attack him so routinely across the later seasons that the show eventually treats the constant attempts on his life as background noise. A man so dangerous that killing him has become a cottage industry, and a man so capable that the industry never succeeds. What distinguishes this tier from ordinary fictional toughness is the quality of attention underneath it. Rick does not win fights by being unkillable in the way an invincible hero is unkillable. He wins by perceiving the entire situation faster and more completely than anyone around him, clocking every exit, every object's potential as a weapon, every opponent's weakness and likely next move, and assembling a solution out of whatever the room contains. The body of a rat becomes an arm. A grappling sequence becomes a lesson in leverage. A hopeless standoff becomes a negotiation he has already won because he saw the leverage before the other side knew it existed. The survivor tier is the inventor tier accelerated to the speed of danger. The same refusal to accept a fixed set of rules now applied to the question of staying alive in the next 4 seconds rather than the question of powering a car. The tier also carries the most thrilling and the least reflective version of his mind, and the show is quietly uneasy about exactly that. A man who survives everything has no external limit, no force in the universe strong enough to impose a consequence on him by force, which means the only thing that could ever stop Rick is Rick. The survivor tier removes the natural brake that mortality places on most lives, and the series keeps probing what happens to a person who has effectively deleted the possibility of being beaten. The answer it returns, again and again, is that the absence of an external limit does not produce freedom. It produces a man with nothing to push against, who has to invent his own reasons to keep going because because the universe has stopped supplying them, and who fills that vacuum with revenge missions and benders and adventures precisely because survival, for him, has become too easy to give his days any shape. The Wedding Squancher's surrender remains the key to the whole tier, because it locates the single crack in an otherwise seamless competence. Confronted with a threat to himself, Rick is untouchable. Confronted with a threat to the handful of people he has let inside the wall, his survival calculus breaks, and he will trade his own freedom, his own safety, even his own life, to keep them out of the line of fire. The show returns to this crack constantly, the realization that the deadliest improviser in the multiverse can be checkmated by nothing except love, and that he resents the vulnerability even as he keeps choosing it. The man who can escape any prison cannot escape the people he cares about, and on some level, he does not want to, which is the most human thing the Survivor tier ever reveals about him. That crack is also where the Survivor tier connects back to the show's larger diagnosis. Rick's body keeps surviving because his mind refuses to stop solving, and his mind refuses to stop solving partly because solving is how he avoids stillness, and stillness is where the grief lives. The constant danger he courts is not only an occupational hazard of interdimensional travel, it is, on some reading the show clearly invites, a chosen environment, a way to keep the reflexes firing and the stakes high enough that there is never a quiet moment in which the loss might catch up to him. Survival becomes a kind of running. The same instinct that pulls him out of a Federation prison or a sewer full of rats is the instinct that keeps him moving fast enough that nothing internal can ever land a clean hit. He is, at this level, brilliant at not dying and equally brilliant at not living, and the show keeps both halves of that sentence on screen at once. The first season episode, M. Night Shyamalan Aliens, shows the Survivor tier operating as pure perception rather than violence. Alien con artists trap Rick inside a layered simulation, hoping the comfort of a faked reality will trick him into revealing the formula for his concentrated dark matter, and he detects the deception almost immediately by noticing tiny inconsistencies in the physics around him, the way a price is slightly wrong, the way a familiar detail fails to behave. Rather than panic, he plays along, feeds his captors a deliberately useless fake recipe, and escapes the moment the ruse is set. The episode is a quiet showcase for the tier's foundation, an attention so total that an entire constructed universe cannot fool it for long, because Rick survives not by being stronger than the trap, but by seeing the seams a calmer mind would miss. The fourth season opener, Edge of Tomorty, pushes the tier to the edge of death itself. Mortally wounded and bleeding out on an alien world, Rick keeps himself alive by hopping his consciousness through a string of his own dying bodies, and finally into the body of an alternate version of himself, treating his own death as a logistics problem to be rooted around, rather than an ending to be feared. The Survivor tier here reveals its most chilling property, that even mortality has become, for him, a kind of inconvenience he can engineer past, which is exactly why the show keeps searching for the one threat that can still reach a man who has made dying optional. A being who can survive his own death has removed the last natural limit on a life, and the series treats that removal as a problem rather than a triumph. The frequency of the attempts on his life builds the tier into the texture of the show. Bounty hunters, assassins, and an entire cottage industry of supervillains treat killing Rick as the ultimate credential, and the series eventually plays the constant ambushes as background comedy. A man so dangerous that ending him has become a career path, and so capable that the career path is a dead end. He dispatches most of these threats with a contempt that doubles as efficiency, barely interrupting whatever he was already doing, and the casualness is the demonstration. The Survivor tier is not a mode he switches into under pressure. It runs continuously, a permanent low hum of total situational awareness that means he is never actually caught off guard, only briefly inconvenienced by people who mistook surprise for an advantage. What the tier costs, underneath the spectacle, is any possibility of stillness. A mind running constant threat assessment is a mind that never fully relaxes, never lets the guard down, never sits in a quiet room without cataloging the exits. And the show suggests that Rick long ago lost the ability to be anywhere without being ready to flee or fight. The Survivor tier keeps the body alive by keeping the nervous system perpetually armed, and a perpetually armed nervous system is incompatible with rest, with intimacy, with the slow, unguarded presence the higher tiers will reveal he most needs and least allows himself. He survives everything and is at peace with nothing, and the series keeps both halves of that bargain visible, the man who cannot be killed and the man who, for that very reason, can never quite stop running. The Purge planet in Look Who's Purging Now shows the tier converting a death trap into a hunting ground. Stranded on a world that legalizes one night of unrestricted slaughter, with the locals closing in, Rick scavenges materials and assembles weapons and powered armor on the fly, ally, and the night that was meant to kill him becomes a one-sided demonstration of what happens when an environment built for murder meets a mind that treats murder as an engineering specialty. The episode underlines the tier's core trait, that hostility is just another set of variables to him, and a place designed to be lethal is, in his hands, simply a place full of useful raw material. He does not escape the purge so much as repurpose it, and the distinction captures everything about how the survivor tier reads the world. The Pickle Rick compound sequence ends on a maneuver that captures the tier's flexibility, because when Rick is finally cornered and outmatched by a lethal enforcer named Jaguar, he stops fighting and starts talking, reading the man's circumstances in seconds, and converting a deathmatch into an alliance before the next blow can land. Survival, at this level, is not only about violence or escape, but about the speed of his social calculation under fire. The ability to recognize in the middle of a brawl that the smarter play is to make the deadliest person in the room an ally rather than a corpse. He walks out of that building beside the very man sent to kill him, and the reversal demonstrates that the survivor tier draws on every other level at once. The manipulator and the strategist and the tinkerer, all firing together in real time. The thing that keeps him alive is not any single skill, but the seamless way his whole mind cooperates when the stakes turn immediate. A genius that becomes most integrated at the exact moment his life is most in danger. So the third level proves that Rick's intelligence is not confined to the bench, that it operates just as fluidly in chaos as in calculation, and that no external force in the series has ever come close to ending him. It also plants the survivor tier's quiet contradiction, a man who cannot be killed by the universe and cannot quite figure out what to do with the life that fact leaves him holding. From here, the climb turns from the threats Rick survives to the people he steers, because the next level of his intelligence operates not on rats and Federation guards, but on the minds of everyone close enough to be useful to him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The survivor tier showed a mind that turns any trap into an exit and any room into a weapon, undone only by the people it refuses to lose. Next, we go to the fourth level, where Rick's intelligence turns inward on the human beings around him, the social and psychological reading that lets him steer a room as easily as he steers a spaceship. Section 5, Level 4, the Manipulator. The fourth level moves the same analytic engine off machines and onto people, and it is the first tier where Rick's intelligence stops being mostly thrilling and starts being mostly troubling. He reads human beings the way he reads a circuit, tracing the wiring of a person's fears and needs and vanities until he knows exactly which contact to touch to make them do what he wants. The show establishes this early and never lets it go. He wins arguments by making the other party feel stupid for having started one. He diffuses resistance by locating the insecurity underneath it and pressing. He treats a conversation as a system with inputs and outputs, and he is almost never the one who walks away having been moved. The manipulator tier is where his genius reveals its temperature, because reading people this well and choosing to use it this way are two different facts, and the show is interested in the gap between them. His grandson is the clearest and saddest demonstration. The entire premise of the series, the old man pulling a 14-year-old out of school to serve as a companion on dangerous adventures, is an act of sustained manipulation dressed as mentorship. Rick exploits Morty's eagerness to be needed, his fear of disappointing the only adult who finds him interesting, and his guilt whenever an adventure goes wrong. And he keeps the boy close through a steady mixture of flattery, intimidation, and the implication that Morty is nothing without him. The show is honest about how much of this is grooming a useful asset rather than raising a grandson, and it gives the dynamic a chillingly literal foundation in the established detail that a Morty's mind masks a Rick's brainwaves, which means the relationship began, on Rick's side, with the cold calculation that the boy made effective cover. The manipulator tier turns the most intimate bond in the series into a long negotiation in which only one party knows the terms. The family as a whole orbits the same gravity. Beth is held in place by a lifetime of carefully managed approval, kept perpetually uncertain whether she is brilliant in her own right or merely the daughter of genius, a doubt Rick could ease at any moment and instead leaves open because her need for his validation keeps her loyal and keeps her close. When he eventually offers to clone her so one version can stay home while the other chases adventure, the gesture looks like generosity and functions like control, a way of removing even the friction of her own choices. Jerry, whom Rick despises, is managed through open contempt that keeps him cowed and harmless. Summer is the one he manipulates least, which the show frames almost as a compliment, a grudging recognition that she is sharp enough to see some of the strings. Around the dinner table, the smartest man in the universe is running the same situational read he runs on hostile aliens, sorting everyone present into levers and obstacles. Two relationships expose the tier most fully by holding a mirror to it. The first is Unity, the hive mind from the second season episode Autoerotic Assimilation, an entity whose entire nature is the assimilation of other minds into a single, controlled will. Rick's ex turns out to be, quite literally, mass mind control, given a personality. And the show lets the symbolism do its work without underlining it. The two of them recognize each other instantly because they are the same kind of creature, beings who reshape everyone around them to suit their own desires. And the relationship burns hot precisely because each can finally drop the pretense and control without apology. Unity ultimately leaves him, and the breakup notes she writes carry the episode's verdict, an admission that Rick brings out a version of her so destructive that she has to flee her own happiness to survive him. A being that controls entire planets recognizes Rick as the more dangerous influence and runs. The manipulator tier, seen from the inside of another manipulator, looks like a black hole. The second mirror is the third season episode that sends up the superhero team known as the Vindicators. Recruited for a mission by a league of celebrated heroes who need his intelligence and cannot stand his presence, Rick responds to being handled by handling them right back, getting blackout drunk and engineering an elaborate gauntlet of lethal puzzles that forces the team to confront their own hypocrisies and turn on one another. The episode reveals that even when Rick is too intoxicated to remember building the trap, his manipulation runs on autopilot, a drunk man's subconscious still capable of constructing a psychological maze precisely calibrated to dismantle a group of strangers. The tier is so deeply wired into him that it functions below conscious thought, which is part of why it is so corrosive. He cannot turn it off, and most of the time, he does not try. By the fifth season, the show takes the manipulator tier to its paranoid endpoint with the decoy families of the episode Mortiplicity, in which it is revealed that Rick has seeded his life with multiple duplicate versions of his own household, each one a deception meant to absorb an attack intended for the real family. The reveal is played for escalating absurdity as decoy turns on decoy, and underneath the comedy sits a genuinely bleak portrait of a mind so committed to deception that it has made copies of the people it loves and arranged for some of them to die in the other's place. Manipulation at this scale stops being a social skill and becomes a worldview, an assumption that everything, including his own family, is a piece to be positioned, hidden, and if necessary, sacrificed. The tier that began as reading a room ends as a man who can no longer be sure which version of his own life is the authentic one. The cost of this level is the most insidious of any so far, because it does its damage quietly and to the people he is closest to. The survivor tier hurts Federation guards. The manipulator tier hurts Morty and Beth. The very skill that lets Rick predict and steer everyone around him is the skill that prevents anyone from ever truly reaching him, because a man who is always running the conversation is a man who is never inside it, never exposed, never moved. The therapist Dr. Wong puts the broader version of this on the table in Pickle Rick, observing that the family uses intelligence to justify its sickness. And the manipulator tier is the engine room of exactly that pattern, the place where a brilliant mind is spent not on connection, but on the management of distance. Rick reads people perfectly and uses the reading to keep them at the precise range where they can be useful and cannot get close. And yet the show refuses to let the tier be purely cynical, because it keeps catching Rick at moments when the manipulation slips and something unmanaged shows through. He cannot fully control his grief over Diane. He cannot manipulate his way out of the loneliness that follows Unity's departure. He cannot keep Morty from growing over the seasons into someone who increasingly sees the strings and occasionally refuses to dance on them. The manipulator tier is formidable, and it is also, in the end, a defense. And the series is careful to show the seams in the armor, the instances where the man who steers everyone is helpless in front of the few feelings he cannot route around. The reading he does on others, he will not do on himself, and that single refusal is the hairline crack running through this entire level of his mind. The tier scales from the dinner table to the halls of power without changing its method. Across several seasons, Rick conducts a running feud with the President of the United States, a relationship the show plays as psychological warfare between two men who each believe they should be in charge. And Rick wins it the same way he wins everything, by reading the President's vanity and need for control, and pressing on both until the most powerful human on Earth is reduced to a sputtering rival in a personal grudge match. The episodes are comedies about ego, and underneath them sits the same demonstration, a man who can manipulate a head of state with the identical toolkit he uses on his 14-year-old grandson. Because to the manipulator tier, a president and a teenager are simply two systems with findable inputs. The show is careful, though, to chart the one relationship where the tier slowly loses its grip, which is Rick's hold on Morty. Early seasons show the manipulation working almost frictionlessly, the boy pulled along by guilt and awe. But the series lets Morty grow, and by the later seasons, he reads some of the strings, calls out some of the lies, and occasionally refuses the role he was cast in. The manipulator tier meets in the person of the one child it most thoroughly used, a moving target that learns, and the show treats Morty's hard-won resistance as a kind of victory precisely because it is so rare. Almost no one ever gets better at not being handled by Rick, and the fact that Morty does, slowly and at great cost, is one of the few hopeful arcs the series allows. The third season episode, Rest and Ricklaxation, exposes what the tier is built to protect by literalizing it. Detoxed at an alien spa, Rick is split into two beings, a healthy version and a separate entity made of everything toxic he had buried. And the toxic self is revealed to carry not just his cruelty, but his self-loathing, his fear, and the raw need he spends every waking hour managing out of sight. The episode makes plain that the manipulator tier is, at bottom, a defense, an elaborate apparatus for keeping other people at the precise distance where they cannot see the wound the toxic self contains. He reads and steers everyone around him not merely to get what he wants, but to ensure no one ever gets close enough to glimpse what he is hiding. And the social genius the show admires turns out to be, on inspection, the most sophisticated wall a frightened person ever built. Seen beside Dr. Wong's diagnosis, the tier completes the show's indictment of how Rick spins his mind. The therapist observes that the family uses intelligence to justify its sickness, and the manipulator tier is the working machinery of exactly that, a brilliant social instrument pointed almost entirely at the maintenance of distance rather than the building of closeness. The same precision that lets him disassemble a hero team while blackout drunk could, in principle, be turned toward understanding and repairing the people he loves. And the tragedy the series keeps underlining is that he almost never points it there. He understands everyone perfectly and lets no one in, and the manipulator tier is the exact mechanism by which that self-imposed isolation is built and maintained, one perfectly read room at a time. The first season episode, Something Wicked This Way Comes, shows the tier turned outward as social demolition rather than personal control. When Summer takes a job at a shop run by a devil figure who hands out cursed objects, Rick responds not with sympathy, but with a campaign, opening a rival business that neutralizes every curse for free and methodically dismantling the devil's entire operation out of what looks like spite and functions like protectiveness. The episode reveals a quieter use of the manipulator tier, the way Rick will weaponize his understanding of people and systems on behalf of family, so long as doing so never requires him to actually say that he cares. He will burn down a devil's livelihood for Summer and would sooner die than tell her why, which is the manipulator tier and the emotional avoidance braided into a single gesture. The most refined version of the tier rarely involves an outright lie, which is part of what makes it so hard for the people around him to resist. Rather than deceive directly, Rick prefers to engineer the conditions of a choice so that the other person arrives, apparently on their own, at the decision he wanted all along, leaving them feeling autonomous while they walk a path he quietly laid. He maneuvers Morty into volunteering for danger by framing reluctance as cowardice. He keeps Beth loyal by rationing approval rather than withholding it outright, so she keeps chasing the next scrap. He governs the household less through commands than through a carefully maintained emotional climate in which the outcomes he prefers feel like everyone's own idea. This is the manipulator tier at its most insidious, a man who has learned that the most durable control is the kind the controlled person mistakes for freedom. And the show is clear that he applies the craft most relentlessly to the people who trust him most, because trust is precisely the opening the technique requires. So the fourth level reveals the temperature of Rick's genius, a social intelligence so acute it can disassemble a hero team while drunk, and so misused that it isolates him from his own family. It also sharpens the show's thesis into something close to an accusation, that the tragedy of the smartest man in the universe is not that he cannot understand people, but that he understands them too well to ever need them honestly. From here, the climb leaves the realm of single rooms and individual minds and widens to its largest scale yet, the long-game intelligence that builds institutions, plans across decades, and, for the first time in the whole descent, finally meets opponents who can beat him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Manipulator tier showed a mind that reads people like circuitry and uses the skill to hold even its own family at arm's length. Next, the focus turns to the 5th level, the long game strategist who founds cities and plots across decades, and the first place in the whole climb where the show lets Rick genuinely lose. Section 6, Level 5, the strategist. The 5th level is where the timescale of Rick's intelligence stretches past any single scheme and into plans that take decades to mature. Institutions built to outlast their founder, and a willingness to spend years, lives, and whole realities in pursuit of a distant goal. The strategist tier is the most ambitious expression of his mind, and also the most revealing, because the show finally lets the audience see what he points all this planning at, and the answer reframes the entire character. The grandest strategic projects of his life are not, on close inspection, about building anything. They are about avoiding something, executed at a scale only a mind like his could manage. The clearest monument to the tier is the Citadel of Ricks itself. As the 5th season finale Rick Murray Jack eventually lays out, Rick C-137 did not merely join the society of his own counterparts, he forged it. After the loss that set his life on its course, he tore down an earlier, looser union of Ricks and organized the survivors into the Council of Ricks, building the Citadel as its seat. An entire civilization of his own duplicates, a government, a class system, a population in the millions, all of it traceable to one Rick's strategic decision to centralize and control his own kind. The man does not simply outthink other people. He builds the institutions other versions of himself will live inside, then treats those institutions as instruments, dismantling the council without hesitation in the Rick Shank Rickdemption the moment it becomes more obstacle than asset. The strategist tier operates on the assumption that even a civilization is a tool, useful while it serves the plan and disposable when it does not. The largest structure he ever helped raise is the central finite curve, the walled-off region of the multiverse, engineered so that every reality inside it is one where a Rick is the smartest being present. As a strategic act, it is almost incomprehensibly vast, a plan executed across infinity itself, and as a window into the man, it is devastating, because it reveals that his single greatest feat of long-term planning was a refusal to risk a fair contest. The strategist tier did not build the curve to achieve something. It built the curve to guarantee that nothing could ever threaten his supremacy, a multiversal safety wall disguised as an empire. Every other plan he runs is a smaller version of the same move, the management of conditions so that the outcome is decided before the contest begins. And the curve is simply that instinct expanded to the size of all creation. The defining strategic project of his actual life, though, is the hunt for Rick Prime. After Rick Prime murdered Diane and a young Beth, Rick C-137 spent decades, by the show's own accounting, systematically traveling the multiverse and killing version after version of himself in search of the specific counterpart responsible. The portal gun, the Citadel, the curve, the entire apparatus of his existence can be read as infrastructure built in service of that one pursuit. When he could not find his target, he made the coldly strategic decision to settle in a dimension whose own Rick had abandoned his family, reasoning that he could slip into the empty space, wait, and eventually ambush Rick Prime when he returned, which reframes the show's whole domestic premise as the long stakeout of a man using his daughter's household as a hunting blind. The strategist tier turned grief into a multi-decade operation, and the operation was elaborate enough to organize an entire life around so that the grief itself never had to be felt directly. This is also the first tier in the climb where the show deliberately lets Rick lose, and it lets him lose to opponents who beat him on his own terms. Rick Prime, the original counterpart, evades the greatest manhunt in the multiverse for the better part of a lifetime, stays a step ahead of every plan, and is described as the superior combatant when the two finally meet, which means that even inside the board Rick rigged for himself, there exists a version who outclasses him. Evil Morty, the patient architect of the long game running underneath the whole series, outplans Rick at every turn, climbs the rigged ladder of the Citadel to its presidency, cracks the central finite curve that the smartest men in the universe believed was unbreakable, and walks out into true infinity, carrying the schematics for a weapon that can erase anyone from existence. The strategist tier meets two minds it cannot reliably outmaneuver, and the show treats both defeats as earned rather than fluky, a deliberate puncturing of the idea that Rick's planning is infallible. The most quietly brutal failure of the tier, though, is not a defeat at the hands of an enemy. It is the success that empties him. When Rick finally corners Rick Prime Prime in the 7th season episode Unmortrican with unwanted assistance from Evil Morty and beats his nemesis to death after decades of pursuit, the show does not give him triumph. It gives him a void. The mission that organized his entire existence is complete, and what remains is a man with no goal, visibly despondent, asking what he is even supposed to do now. The strategist here built a life out of a revenge plan precisely because the plan was load-bearing, because as long as the hunt continued, he never had to sit in the grief that started it. Achieving the goal removes the scaffolding and leaves the original wound exactly where it always was, untouched by all those decades of brilliant planning. The smartest long game in the multiverse turns out to have been an elaborate detour around a single afternoon he could not bear to feel. That is the show's deepest move at this level. The revelation that Rick's strategic genius is real and total and pointed almost entirely at avoidance. The curve avoids a fair comparison. The revenge hunt avoids the grief. The decoy families avoid loss by manufacturing replaceable versions of the people he loves. The contingency clones and backups avoid even his own death. Seen together, the grandest products of the strategist here form a single coherent project, a lifetime of monumental planning devoted to ensuring that nothing, not a rival, not a feeling, not mortality itself, can ever land a clean and final blow. The mind that can plan across decades has spent those decades building walls, and the show keeps asking the obvious question underneath all of it, which is what a man is protecting when he goes to that much trouble never to be reached. The institutions also outlive their purpose and turn on him, which the strategist here never quite anticipates. The Citadel he founded becomes the breeding ground for Evil Morty, the one being patient enough to weaponize Rick's own structures against him. The curve he helped build becomes the cage Evil Morty most wants to escape, and breaking it becomes the engine of the series' longest arc. The contingencies meant to protect him become liabilities, the backups and decoys spawning their own chaos. A recurring irony of this level is that Rick is brilliant at building systems and consistently blind to the way his systems develop interests of their own, because the same arrogance that lets him plan on a cosmic scale convinces him that nothing he builds will ever outgrow his control. The strategist here wins for decades, and then watches its own creations become the instruments of its defeats. The fullest case study in strategic defeat is Evil Morty, whose entire arc is a patient demolition of the idea that Rick's planning cannot be beaten. Introduced as a shadowy figure in the first season episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, revealed as the puppet master behind a candidate in the 3rd season's tour of the Citadel, and finally unmasked in the 5th season finale as the architect of a multi-season scheme to escape the central finite curve, Evil Morty wins by understanding the Ricks better than they understand themselves. He grasps that their arrogance is a predictable weakness, that they will always assume no Morty could outthink them, and he builds his entire plan on that single blind spot, climbing a ladder designed to keep his kind at the bottom and then dismantling the ladder on his way out. The strategist here meets, in Evil Morty, a mind that strategizes about Rick's strategizing and loses. The cat and mouse with Rick Prime across the 6th and 7th seasons exposes the limits of the tier from the other direction. Rick Prime is not patient like Evil Morty. He is simply better at the specific game Rick C-137 has organized his life around, staying hidden, staying ahead, and deploying a weapon, the Omega device, capable of erasing a person from every reality at once. That device is the reason the hunt could never simply be solved by grabbing a replacement Diane from another universe, because Rick Prime used it to erase her from all of them, a strategic masterstroke of cruelty that the greatest planner in the multiverse spent decades unable to answer. The strategist here, confronted with an opponent who plays its own game at a higher level, can only keep grinding forward, and the show lets that grind consume most of a lifetime. Even Rick's contingencies, the backups and decoys that should be the strategist tier's safety net, tend to curdle into liabilities. The 6th season premiere Solarix turns one of his own maintenance routines into a disaster when resetting the portal fluid accidentally flings every traveler in range back to their reality of origin, scattering his family and reopening the door to Rick Prime, a strategic housekeeping task that detonates into a season's worth of consequence. The decoy families of the 5th season spawn their own warring duplicates. The institutions he founds outgrow him. A recurring blindness defines the tier, the assumption that nothing he builds will ever develop interests of its own, and the assumption is wrong so consistently that the show treats it as the strategist's signature flaw, a planner brilliant enough to account for everything except the autonomy of his own creations. Underneath all of it sits the reframing that gives the tier its weight, the recognition that Rick's grandest plans systems are, at root, machines for not feeling. The curve is a plan to never risk comparison. The hunt is a plan to never sit in grief. The decoys are a plan to never truly lose anyone. The backups are a plan to never truly die. Read together, the monuments of the strategist tier form one coherent lifelong project, a vast and brilliant effort to ensure that nothing, no rival, no emotion, no ending, can ever land a final blow. And the show keeps asking the question that project cannot answer, which is, what a man is really defending when he goes to such cosmic lengths never to be reached. The mind that can plan across decades has spent those decades building walls, and the walls, in the end, are the plan. The founding story itself, revealed in fragments and then in full, marks the tier's origin and its first great act. After the loss that set his course, Rick did not simply wander the multiverse alone. He encountered an existing loose union of Ricks and, rather than join it, tore it apart and rebuilt the survivors into the Council of Ricks under his own design, raising the Citadel as its capital. The strategist tier was born in that act of organized destruction and reconstruction, a man turning even his own grief-stricken hunt into the foundation of an interdimensional government. And the show treats the detail as definitive. He does not participate in structures. He founds them, bends them to his purpose, and discards them when they no longer serve. And the entire civilization of his own duplicates exists because one Rick decided in his worst years that the most efficient way to search infinity was to first build an institution and put himself at its head. The strategist here even plans around his own death, which is where it meets its eeriest mirror in Rick Prime. Both versions of the man hedged against mortality with contingencies, and the 7th season makes the parallel explicit when evil Morty destroys Rick Prime's backups, the hidden duplicates that would have let him return after being killed, finally stripping away the safety net that had kept him effectively immortal for decades. Rick C-137 runs the same kind of insurance across the series. The clone bodies, the consciousness transfers, the decoys, all of it engineered so that even death becomes a problem he has solved in advance. The strategist here treats his own ending as one more variable to be hedged, and the show finds something bleak in that, because a man who has planned his way out of dying has also, in a quiet sense, planned his way out of stakes, removing the final pressure that gives most lives their shape. The grandest strategist in the multiverse spent his genius ensuring that nothing, not even death, could impose a real ending on him. And the result is a man left with no natural reason to ever stop. So the 5th level shows the full reach of Rick's mind, the capacity to found civilizations, wall off infinity, and sustain a single plan across a lifetime. And it shows the show finally willing to let that mind be beaten. It also delivers the climb's central reversal, the discovery that all this magnificent planning has been aimed underneath every layer at not feeling one specific loss. From here, the ascent leaves the realm of plans and enemies entirely and turns toward the strangest level of his intelligence, the awareness that perceives the very structure of the reality he lives inside, including the unsettling possibility that the structure is a story. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The strategist here showed a mind that found cities and walls off infinity, all of it a decades-long detour around a grief it would not feel. Next, we go to the 6th level, the meta-awareness that lets Rick see the shape of the multiverse itself and the cold knowledge that nothing inside it was ever built to matter. Section 7, Level 6, the meta-mind. The 6th level is the hardest to film and the easiest to feel because it has no gadget and no battlefield. It is the tier on which Rick perceives the structure of the reality he lives in, the scale of the multiverse, the meaninglessness that scale implies, and, in the show's strangest stretches, the suspicion that the whole thing is a constructed narrative with him cast as a character in it. The metamind is the level closest to the show's own voice, and it is also the intellectual root of his nihilism, because once a mind sees the full shape of an infinite reality, most of the things other minds use to anchor a life stop holding any weight. The clearest articulation of the tier arrives early, in the first season episode Rixty Minutes, when Summer, devastated to learn she was an unplanned pregnancy and considering running away, is talked down by Morty in a scene that has become the show's emotional thesis statement. Morty tells her, gently and without cruelty, that he comes from a reality where he watched himself die and buried his own body in the backyard, and that the lesson he took from it is that no one exists for a reason, no one belongs anywhere in particular, and everyone is eventually going to die. So the only sane response is to stop searching for cosmic significance and come watch television. The speech is delivered by Morty, but the worldview is pure Rick. The philosophy of a mind that has seen infinite versions of everyone and concluded that uniqueness is an illusion. The meta tier is what produces that conclusion, and the show treats it as simultaneously liberating and corrosive, a truth that frees the family from false pressure and also hollows out every reason to care. Rick lives permanently inside that perspective. Because he travels an infinite multiverse, he knows that for every version of his family, there are uncountable others, that any tragedy in one reality is undone in a billion neighbors, that he himself exists in endless variation, most of them already dead by their own hand or someone else's. The interdimensional cable episodes literalize the tier as comedy, parking him on the couch to watch infinite alternate channels of infinite alternate realities, a man for whom the entire concept of a single precious world has dissolved into static. The death crystals from the 4th season make the perspective tactile, letting a holder watch all their possible futures branch and end. And Rick treats the device as a toy, because seeing every possible death is, to him, merely a vivid version of how he already understands existence. The meta tier means he is never fully present in any one reality, because part of his mind is always aware of the infinite alternatives surrounding it. And a thing that exists in infinite copies is, almost by definition, a thing he struggles to treat as mattering. The show pushes the tier past cosmic awareness and into outright narrative awareness in its most experimental episodes. In the 4th season episode, Never Ricking Morty, the family is trapped aboard a literal story train, a setting that runs on the mechanics of storytelling itself, where characters discuss plot, canon, character development, and serialization out loud as forces acting on them, and Rick navigates the threat by reasoning explicitly about narrative structure as though it were a physical system to be hacked. In the 6th season episode Full Meta Jack Rick, the family crosses beyond the 4th wall into a meta layer populated by entities who know they are fictional, and Rick treats the revelation that he might be a character with the same irritated competence he brings to any other engineering problem. The show is playing, of course, but it is playing with a genuine idea about its protagonist, the notion that a mind smart enough to see the structure of its universe might eventually see the structure of its own story, and that such a mind would find the discovery less liberating than exhausting. The knowledge that one might be a character only drains a little more meaning out of the day. What makes the meta tier matter to the larger portrait is that it supplies Rick with the intellectual justification for everything the lower tiers do. If nothing is unique and nothing finally matters, then poisoning a planet and skipping to the next one is not a moral catastrophe. It is housekeeping. If every version of his family exists a billion times over, then the specific family in front of him is not irreplaceable, which conveniently licenses him to keep them at arm's length. The therapist, Doctor. Wong's central observation that the family uses intelligence to justify sickness finds its purest fuel at this level, because the meta tier hands Rick a genuinely sophisticated philosophical argument for why caring is naive, and he deploys that argument constantly as a shield against the work of actually caring. The nihilism is real and intellectually earned, and it is also the most elegant excuse a brilliant man ever built for not having to feel anything. The cruelty the show works into the tier is that Rick's nihilism does not actually protect him. He has every philosophical reason to be free of grief, since in infinite realities, Diane survives, Beth thrives, and nothing is ever truly lost, and none of it helps him at all. The mind that can prove, on the chalkboard of the multiverse, that no single law should matter, is the same mind that froze his entire home dimension on the worst day of his life and built a hologram of his dead wife to keep him company. The meta tier gives him an airtight argument that his pain is irrational, and the pain ignores the argument completely. The show stages that contradiction as the deepest joke in the whole character, a being smart enough to understand that nothing matters and human enough to be destroyed by the one thing that did. Seeing the structure of reality turns out to be no defense against being a person inside it. The tier also isolates him more completely than any other, because it removes the common ground he might share with the people around him. Morty, Beth, Summer, and the rest live inside a single reality they experience as real and consequential, and Rick lives inside an infinite one he experiences as interchangeable, which means that even when he is in the room, he is operating from a frame no one else can fully enter. He cannot take their hopes seriously in the way they need him to, because from where he stands, those hopes are local accidents in an indifferent infinity. The meta tier is the loneliest level of his intelligence precisely because it cannot be shared. A vantage point so high and so cold that the warmth other people live on simply does not reach it. The smartest man in the universe sees the whole board, including the fact that it is a board, and that vision quietly exiles him from everyone who can still believe the game is real. There is one fragile countercurrent the show keeps returning to, and it matters for everything that follows. Despite the airtight nihilism, despite the infinite alternatives, Rick keeps choosing this family, this Morty, this reality, in small, unguarded moments he cannot fully explain and would never admit to. The meta tier tells him none of it should matter, and he keeps behaving as though some of it does, returning, protecting, occasionally even sacrificing, in defiance of his own philosophy. The show never resolves the contradiction, because the contradiction is the man, a mind that has proven meaning is an illusion, and a heart that keeps acting as if a few specific people are exceptions to the proof. The meta tier sees everything and explains everything, and fails, in the end, to talk him out of the one attachment his whole intelligence insists is irrational. The interdimensional cable episodes are the tier's most literal staging, parking Rick on the couch to channel surf through infinite broadcasts from infinite realities. A man for whom the very idea of a single precious world has dissolved into an endless scroll of alternatives. The bit is improvised nonsense on the surface and a thesis underneath, because a person who can watch infinite versions of everything is a person for whom nothing on the screen or off it retains the weight of being the only one. The same perspective drives the grave visiting scene that the series returns to as its emotional core. The moment Morty steadies a despairing Summer by explaining that he has buried his own body, that no one is special in an infinite multiverse, and that the only sane response is to stop searching for cosmic meaning. The worldview is Rick's, distilled, and the show presents it as both a genuine comfort and a genuine poison, a truth that frees the family from false pressure and quietly drains the color out of everything at once. The third season episode Rest and Ricklaxation gives the meta tier a more intimate edge, because the self that gets split off when Rick is detoxed turns out to understand him with perfect clarity, which means his self-awareness is not the problem. He sees himself completely. He knows the shape of his own avoidance, the function of his own nihilism, the exact nature of the wound he is routing around, and the meta tier supplies him with a flawless map of his own pathology that he then declines to use for anything except a more sophisticated defense. Awareness, in his case, is not the first step toward change. It is the raw material for a better excuse, and the show is unusually clear-eyed about how a brilliant mind can know everything about its own sickness and deploy that knowledge entirely in the service of staying sick. The narrative-aware episodes extend the tier into the show's own architecture. Never Ricking Morty traps the family aboard a story train, where plot, canon, and character development operate as physical forces, and Rick escapes by reasoning about storytelling itself as a system to be hacked, openly discussing the mechanics of serialization as though they were laws of physics. Full meta Jack Rick sends the family past the fourth wall, into a layer where fictional beings know they are fictional, and Rick treats the possibility that he is a character with the same irritated competence he brings to any other engineering problem. The play is genuine, and the idea underneath it is serious. The notion that a mind clever enough to see the structure of its universe might eventually see the structure of its own story, and would find the discovery less like liberation than like one more reason to stop caring about a plot that was never going to mean anything regardless. The cruelty the show keeps returning to is that none of this comprehension protects him. He has every philosophical reason to be free of grief, since, in infinite realities, Diane lives, Beth flourishes, and nothing is finally lost, and the argument helps him not at all. The mind that can prove on the chalkboard of the multiverse that no single loss should matter is the same mind that froze a dimension on its worst day and built a hologram of a dead wife to keep the silence company. The meta tier hands him an airtight case that his pain is irrational, and the pain simply ignores the case, and the show stages that contradiction as the deepest truth about him, a being clever enough to understand that nothing matters, and human enough to be quietly destroyed by the one thing that did. The tier also quietly corrodes his appetite for his own life, because a mind that has seen infinite versions of every experience struggles to find any single experience worth having. The adventures that thrill Morty register to Rick as reruns, variations on things he has done across 1,000 realities, and the show occasionally lets that exhaustion surface, the boredom of a being for whom novelty has been mathematically eliminated. When everything has already happened somewhere, and he has likely already seen it, the meta tier drains the one resource the lower tiers cannot replace, which is the simple capacity to be surprised. A man who can be surprised by nothing has very little left to live toward, and the series keeps suggesting that Rick's worst stretches of nihilism are not philosophy at all, but symptom, the natural endpoint of a mind that has consumed too much of infinity to remember how to want anything inside it. The decoy families of the 5th season episode Mortiplicity sharpen the meta tier into a joke the show plays on its own format. A cascade of duplicate households, each convinced it is the genuine one, each as plausible as the last, until the question of which family the audience has been following becomes honestly unanswerable. The gag lands because it externalizes Rick's own perspective, the sense that any given version of his life is merely one instance among interchangeable copies, and it quietly pulls the viewer into the same vertigo. The meta tier is contagious in exactly that way, a frame so corrosive to the idea of a single, authentic reality that once the show invites the audience inside it, even the program's own continuity begins to feel like one option drawn from infinitely many. So the 6th level reveals the coldest and most comprehensive reach of Rick's mind, the awareness of the infinite structure he lives inside, and the meaninglessness it implies, the philosophy that licenses his worst behavior, and the loneliness that vantage point imposes. It also sets up the final and highest level of the climb, because the one thing the metamind cannot reason its way out of is feeling, and the 7th tier is precisely the form of intelligence Rick possesses in full, and refuses, with everything he has, to use. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The meta tier showed a mind that sees the whole infinite structure of reality, and uses the view as an excuse not to care, and finds, to its frustration, that the view never numbs the one loss that counts. Next, the focus turns to the 7th and highest level, the emotional intelligence Rick clearly possesses and spends his entire life refusing to switch on. Section 8, Level 7, the intelligence he refuses. The 7th level inverts the whole climb. Every tier below it is a power Rick flaunts, a capability the show stages as spectacle, a reason the universe fears him. The highest tier is a power he hides, and the show's boldest argument about him is that emotional intelligence, the capacity to understand and sit with feeling, his own and other people's, is not something he lacks at all. He has it in abundance. He reads emotion more accurately than any character in the series, manipulates it with surgical precision, and clearly feels it at a depth that periodically threatens to drown him. What he refuses is to point that intelligence at himself, because using it honestly would mean facing the grief that all 6 lower tiers were built to outrun. The smartest man in the universe is emotionally illiterate, entirely by choice, and the choice is the source of every wound in his orbit. The show states this almost outright in the 3rd season episode Pickle Rick, in the scene with the therapist Dr. Wong. Having turned himself into a pickle specifically to avoid a family therapy session, having then fought through a building of armed mercenaries in a body made of rat parts rather than attend, Rick finally lands on her couch and tries to belittle her profession, and she answers without raising her voice or losing her composure. Her read, delivered calmly, is that the only link between his unquestionable intelligence and the sickness wrecking his family is that all of them, Rick included, use intelligence to justify that sickness, and that he swings between treating his own mind as an unstoppable force and an inescapable curse, because the truly unbearable idea, the one concept he cannot approach, is that the mind is his and within his control. She points out that he chose to come, chose to talk, chose to belittle her, just as he chose to become a pickle. That repairing and maintaining a self is not an adventure and carries no risk of a glorious death, that it is simply work, and that some people would genuinely rather die than do it. Rick says nothing. The show holds on his face, and it is clear the assessment landed, and it is equally clear he will do nothing about it. He would rather build a rat mech and slaughter a compound than spend 20 minutes doing the work, and the episode names that preference as the whole disease. The evidence that the capacity is real and merely suppressed is scattered across the series in its quietest, least defended moments. The 2nd season episode Autoerotic Assimilation reunites him with Unity, the hive mind he once loved, and when she leaves him because she recognizes that he makes her worse, the episode follows him home and does something the show almost never does. It stops being funny. Alone in his garage, he assembles a device, gently comforts and then puts down a suffering creature he had been keeping, and then arranges the same machine to end his own life, only surviving because he passes out before it activates. The sequence is staged with sober restraint and scored to a quiet song, and it establishes beyond argument that beneath the armor of the lower 6 tiers is a man in profound and dangerous pain. The emotional intelligence is there. He understands his own despair perfectly. What he will not do is treat that understanding as something to act on in any direction other than escape. And the show presents the near miss not as a plot twist, but as the truth the rest of his performance is built to hide. The grief that organizes everything is the loss of Diane, and the 7th tier is where the show finally lets that loss speak. The 5th season finale, Rick Jack, reveals the full history, and when Morty learns the truth and tries to offer his grandfather sympathy, relieved to finally understand him, Rick refuses the moment entirely, brushing the boy off and telling everyone to drop the subject and move on. A lifetime of demonstrated genius for reading and managing emotion, and confronted with genuine compassion aimed at his deepest wound, he deflects it with the reflex of a man slamming a door. The artificial Diane he later builds, revealed in the 6th season premiere Solarix, is the 7th tier's saddest artifact, a hologram of his dead wife installed in a home dimension he kept frozen on the day he lost her. The work of a man who would rather engineer a simulation of love than risk feeling the absence of the real thing. He can recreate her in light and code. He cannot grieve her in the open, and the difference is the entire tragedy. The show is careful to show that the refusal is a choice rather than an incapacity, because it keeps catching Rick using the 7th tier at full strength on behalf of other people while withholding it from himself. He understands exactly what Morty needs to hear and exactly how to wound him. He reads Beth's insecurity so precisely that he can soothe or exploit it at will. His oldest friendship with Bird Person carries a tenderness the series treats as sacred, and the 6th season devotes real time to Rick venturing into the ruined mind of that friend to try to pull him back from the edge, an act of emotional labor he will perform for almost no one else, and performs there without hesitation. The capacity is not missing, it is ration, spent freely on managing others and frozen solid the moment it might require him to be vulnerable. And the show frames that asymmetry as the central failure of his life. The most powerful mind in the multiverse can do the one genuinely difficult thing, the work of feeling, and simply will not. The ending of Pickle Rick crystallizes how the refusal perpetuates itself, because it is not Rick alone who flees the work. After Dr. Wong's assessment lands, Rick and Beth leave the session and immediately dismantle it together, mocking the therapist and making plans to go drinking, while Morty and Summer, the younger generation, quietly express that they would like to keep going. The scene draws the line between the two halves of the family with painful clarity, the elders using their intelligence to wall off the work of healing, and the children still young enough to want it. Rick is not just refusing the 7th tier for himself, he is modeling the refusal, teaching it, passing the avoidance down the generations as surely as he passes down the science. And the show treats that inheritance as the real damage, more lasting than any planet he has poisoned. What gives the 7th tier its terrible weight is that it sits at the top of the ladder for a reason. The show is making an argument about intelligence itself, that the highest form of it is not the power to build universes or outplan a galaxy, but the far harder capacity to be honestly present with feeling, to repair a self and a family rather than escape into another adventure. By placing emotional intelligence above every flashier tier, and then revealing that Rick guards it like a wound, the series inverts the entire premise the audience started with. The smartest man in the universe is, by the show's own scale, operating with his most important faculty deliberately switched off, and every dazzling thing he does on the lower 6 tiers is, at least in part, an elaborate excuse to keep it off. The genius is not the solution to his pain. The genius is the most sophisticated avoidance mechanism ever depicted, and the 7th tier is the locked room at the center of it. The 4th season finale folds the 7th tier into the inventor tier with quiet precision, when Rick clones Beth and then erases his own knowledge of which version is the original. The maneuver is engineering in service of avoidance, a way of using the most advanced biology imaginable to ensure he never has to sit with the weight of having chosen, never has to know which daughter he kept and which he sent away. A man capable of that much technical care chooses to aim it at manufacturing his own ignorance, because knowing would mean feeling, and feeling is the one operation the 7th tier could perform, and he refuses to run. The episode treats the erased memory as the saddest kind of solution, a problem of the heart answered with a syringe. The show keeps testing whether the refusal can ever break, and the results are deliberately partial. In a later season, Rick returns to the same therapist who once read him so cleanly, an act that looks for a moment like progress, and the visit becomes another study in how a brilliant mind metabolizes the work of healing into something it can win, twisting even the act of seeking help into a performance of self-sufficiency. The seventh tier flickers on and then off, the capacity briefly engaged and then walled away again, and the series refuses to let it resolve into a tidy recovery, because the honest portrait of a person built this way is not a cure, but a long oscillation. Brief openings, followed by the familiar retreat behind the lower 6 tiers. The asymmetry is the whole point, and the show stages it constantly. Rick will perform enormous feats of emotional labor for the rare person he has decided is worth it, reading exactly what they need, providing it without hesitation, venturing into a ruined friend's mind to drag him back from death. The same man cannot extend a fraction of that care to himself, cannot accept Morty's offered sympathy, cannot grieve his wife in the open, cannot sit on a couch for 20 minutes and do the unglamorous work the therapist named. The seventh tier is not absent, and it is not weak. It is rationed with a precision that is itself a kind of genius, spent freely outward and frozen solid inward. And the show frames that single asymmetry as the deciding fact of his life, the place where all his intelligence finally fails him by his own design. What makes the tier the summit rather than an afterthought is the argument the placement makes about intelligence itself. The series builds its whole ladder to suggest that the highest form of a mind is not the power to author universes or outplan a galaxy, but the far harder capacity to be honestly present with feeling, to repair a self and a family rather than flee into the next adventure. By seating emotional intelligence above every flashier tier, and then revealing that Rick guards it like a wound, the show inverts the premise the audience began with and lands its hardest claim, that the smartest being ever depicted is operating with his single most important faculty switched off on purpose, and that every dazzling thing he does on the 6 tiers below is, in some measure, an elaborate excuse to keep it dark. The friendship with Bird Person is the clearest evidence that the 7th tier is fully operational when Rick chooses to engage it. His oldest comrade from the Galactic Resistance, the one being who knew him before the bitterness hardened, Bird Person holds a place in Rick's life the series treats as nearly sacred. And when Bird Person is reduced to a cybernetic husk, Rick devotes extraordinary effort across the 6th season to entering the ruins of his friend's mind and pulling him back towards something like life. Inside those memories, Rick is forced to confront his own past directly. The war, the love, the choices that shape both of them. And the sequence shows a man performing exactly the emotional labor he spends the rest of the series refusing, fully capable of tenderness, presence, and the hard work of staying with another person's pain. The 7th tier works. He simply reserves it for the rarest occasions and the fewest people, and almost never turns it on the one person who needs it most, which is himself. A consistent grammar governs the rare moments the 7th tier surfaces, which is that Rick expresses love almost entirely through action, and almost never through words. He will cross the multiverse for Morty and refuse to say he cares. He will dismantle a devil's business to protect Summer and call it boredom. He will surrender his freedom for the family and frame it as cold strategy. The series builds an entire emotional vocabulary out of that gap, training the audience to read his feeling in what he does rather than in anything he admits, because admitting it aloud would demand the vulnerability the 7th tier requires, and he refuses to pay. When Morty offers sympathy in the wake of the Great Revelation, the deflection arrives so fast it reads as reflex, a man swatting away tenderness the way he swats away a threat. The capacity to feel is intact and even overflowing, the capacity to be seen feeling, to let another person witness the wound rather than infer it, is the precise thing he has spent a lifetime engineering around, and the show treats that single refusal as the hinge on which his whole tragedy turns. So the highest level completes the climb by turning it inside out, revealing that the capacity Rick most needs is the one he possesses in full and refuses with everything he has, and that this single refusal is the hidden source of the loneliness, the addiction, and the near miss in the garage. It also sets up the reckoning the next section has to make, because once all 7 tiers are laid out, the question stops being how intelligent Rick is and becomes what all that intelligence has actually cost him, and what, after 8 seasons, it has actually been for. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The 7th tier revealed the cruelest twist of the climb, an emotional intelligence Rick owns completely and refuses to turn on himself, modeling the avoidance for the children who still still want to heal. Next, we go to the full accounting, the price every one of these levels has charged, and the wreckage the smartest mind in the multiverse leaves in its own wake. Section 9. The cost of the climb laid. End to end, the 7 tiers describe a mind without equal, and the show insists on reading that same ladder a second way, because every rung that bought Rick a power also bought him a measure of isolation. The cost is produced by the very traits that make him brilliant. The tinkerer who would rather build than talk. The survivor who keeps moving so nothing can catch him. The strategist who turned grief into a decades-long mission. The meta-mind that argues itself out of caring. Each gift is also a wall, and by the end, the man stands alone behind all 7 of them. The most visible cost is the drinking, present in nearly every scene, played for laughs long before the show lets the audience feel what it covers. The Unity episode supplies the key, when the hive mind observes that her assimilated society phased out intoxicants because there is no need to escape the self when the whole world is already one. Every drink, read through that line, becomes an escape from the self, and the addiction reveals itself as the genius medicating the loneliness the genius created. A closed loop in which the smartest man alive drinks to quiet a mind he cannot switch off and cannot bear to sit with sober. Beneath the drinking sits the floor of the whole cost, the suicide attempt the second season stages with deliberate restraint. After Unity leaves him, recognizing that he makes her worse, Rick goes home, comforts and puts down a suffering creature he had been keeping, and then prepares the same device to end his own life, surviving only because he loses consciousness first. The series does not sensationalize the moment and does not explain it away, letting it stand as the bedrock truth under all the bravado, that a being who has conquered every external threat in the multiverse is, on the inside, a profoundly lonely man who has more than once decided the loneliness was not worth surviving. Every tier of intelligence he owns failed to protect him from that, and the metamind's nihilism actively walked him toward it. Isolation is the steady tax underneath the dramatic lows. The story opens with Rick reappearing on Beth's doorstep after roughly 2 decades of absence, a family he had abandoned long before grief or revenge could be blamed. He keeps a home dimension frozen on the worst day of his life as a shrine rather than a home. He builds a hologram of a dead wife rather than let a living person near. He seeds his life with decoy families so that even love doubles as a security measure. The richest mind ever depicted has spent its riches again and again engineering distance, and the loneliness that results is one of its steadiest products rather than an accident of it. The climb also costs him the comforting fiction of his own supremacy, because the higher tiers keep introducing minds that beat him. Rick Prime evades his greatest manhunt for a lifetime and outfights him at the end. Evil Morty outplans him across the entire series and walks out of the cage the Ricks built. Unity, a being of pure control, recognizes him as too destructive to survive and leaves. Dr. Wong, an ordinary therapist with no gadgets, reads him more accurately in 5 minutes than he has ever allowed himself to be read, and he finds no clever rebuttal, only silence. The title was always provisional, true inside a board he rigged, and false the moment a sharper or more honest mind entered the room. The bill is not paid by Rick alone, which is the part the show treats most seriously. Beth spends the series suspended between believing she is a genius like her father and fearing she is nothing without his approval, a doubt he could resolve and leaves open because her uncertainty keeps her close. Morty hardens season by season, from the early trauma of burying his own corpse to the later episode in which a death crystal sends him spiraling into something genuinely monstrous. Jerry is kept perpetually diminished. Summer, sharp enough to keep pace, is drawn steadily into Rick's orbit and begins to harden in his direction, most at risk not of being dismissed, but of being recruited. The genius passes its wounds down the household more reliably than it passes down its science. The show even lets the avoidance pass openly from one generation to the next. At the close of the therapy episode, after Dr. Wong names the family's habit of using intelligence to dodge the work of healing, Rick and Beth leave the session and immediately dismantle it together, mocking the therapist and planning to go drinking, while Morty and Summer quietly say they would like to keep going. The scene draws the line in plain sight, the elders walling off the work and the children still young enough to want it, and it frames Rick's deepest cost as the one that outlives him, an inheritance of avoidance handed down as surely as the science. The wreckage is not only what the genius destroys in a moment, but what it teaches the people who survive it to keep doing on their own. The emptiest moment of the climb arrives at its apparent peak. When the decades-long hunt for Rick Prime finally ends in victory, the show withholds triumph and delivers a void, a man standing over the corpse of his nemesis with nothing left to organize his life around, visibly lost, lost, asking what he is even supposed to do now. The mission was load-bearing, the one structure holding the grief at bay, and completing it returns him to the loss he started from, now stripped even of the distraction. The strategist could plan across decades and could not plan a way to heal, because healing was the single objective he refused to set. And yet, the series refuses to end the accounting in pure despair, because woven through every cost is the thin, stubborn thread the lower tiers cannot explain. Rick keeps coming back. He surrenders to an empire to protect the family at Bird Person's wedding. He accepts a hug from Morty in the hollow minutes after killing Rick Prime. He keeps choosing this reality and these specific people in moments his own nihilism insists are irrational. And the show treats that irrationality as the only thing that has ever genuinely kept him alive. The smartest man in the universe has paid nearly everything for his climb, and the small unpaid remainder, the part of him that still shows up, is the only part the show seems to think was ever worth anything. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The accounting laid the full bill bare, the addiction and the isolation and the emptiness of a victory that healed nothing, and the one stubborn attachment that survived it all. Next, we go to the final reckoning, the question the whole climb was built to ask, which is what a mind like this is actually for. Section 10. What the smartest man is actually for. After 7 levels and a full accounting of their cost, the question the series has been circling comes into focus. And it is not how smart Rick Sanchez is, because the show settled that long ago. The real question, the one 8 seasons keep returning to, is what all that intelligence is actually for. And the answer is quietly devastating, because by the show's own measure, Rick has used the greatest mind ever depicted to accomplish almost nothing that matters to him. The myth the show starts with treats intelligence as a kind of salvation, the trait that lifts a person above ordinary life and grants freedom and power and a seat above everyone else. The portal gun makes the case visually, a man who can leave any situation, any consequence, any reality the instant it stops serving him. And the series spends 8 seasons dismantling that promise from the inside, because the same freedom that lets Rick leave anything is the freedom that lets him stay nowhere. And the same power that solves every external problem is the power that lets him avoid every internal one. He poisons a planet and steps to the next. He ruins a relationship and portals away. The exit the lower tiers keep providing is the exact mechanism by which he avoids the harder thing, which is to stand in a difficult place and remain. The central finite curve reads, from the summit, less as a feat than as a confession. The wall the Ricks built to guarantee their supremacy was never really about being the smartest, the show keeps suggesting. It was about being safe, about ensuring that no rival and no comparison and no surprise could ever reach them. And the price of that safety was infinity itself, a boundless reality traded for a small, guaranteed kingdom in which nothing could threaten or move them. The smartest man in the universe used the greatest intelligence ever depicted to make the universe smaller. And that is the master pattern of his life. Brilliance spent over and over to shrink the world down to something controllable and therefore safely unfelt. What the show offers as the alternative is never a renunciation of his mind, because the series is not against intelligence and never pretends Rick would be better off dull. The alternative it keeps gesturing toward is a different aim for the same gift, the redirection of all that capacity away from escape and toward presence, away from the management of distance and toward the slow, unglamorous repair of a self and a family. The 7th tier sits at the top of the ladder precisely because the show believes the highest use of any mind is the courage to feel honestly and stay. And the tragedy of Rick is that he reaches the summit of every other tier and refuses to climb the last one. Brilliant in every direction except the single one that might actually save him. The series locates its fragile hope in the moments Rick acts against his own philosophy. When he surrenders to an empire to protect his family, when he enters a dying friend's mind to pull him back, when he accepts a grandson's hug in the hollow minutes after a meaningless victory, when he keeps returning to a reality his own nihilism insists does not matter. He is using none of the 7 measurable tiers and doing the one thing all that measurable genius was built to avoid. The show treats these unguarded choices as the only times his intelligence points somewhere worth pointing, and it never lets them harden into a cure, because the man is not cured. He gets glimpses, brief stretches of choosing connection over escape, and then retreats behind the walls again. If the series carries a thesis about intelligence, it is that the trait is a tool rather than a destination or a virtue, and that the measure of a mind is finally the measure of what it chooses to serve. Rick chose for most of his life to serve his own own avoidance. And the show is honest that the choice produced wonders and ruin in roughly equal measure. The portal gun and the mantis apocalypse, the citadel and the loneliness, the revenge that organized a life and the emptiness that followed its completion. The series returns, at the end, to the image it opened with, the man hunched at the workbench, and asks the audience to read it differently. The tinkerer, hiding inside his own competence, was always a symptom rather than the strength it first appeared to be. The opening move in a lifelong retreat that the next 6 tiers only refined. Every level the show laid out points back at that first picture, a boy who preferred the predictable logic of machines to the unpredictable logic of people, grown into a man who built ever more elaborate machines, including universes and governments and a wall around infinity, all to preserve the same retreat. The genius is real and total, and the show never doubts it. What the show doubts is the use. So the 7 levels finally answer their own question. The tinkerer, the inventor, the survivor, the manipulator, the strategist, and the metamind are all, in the end, instruments. And an instrument is only as good as the thing it is aimed at. And Rick has spent most of his existence aiming the finest one ever built at the project of not being reached. The smartest man in the universe is not undone by any limit on his intelligence, because there is none. He is undone by the use he puts it to, the lifelong redirection of a godlike mind toward the single goal of never having to sit still inside his own grief. The show's last word on him is not that he is too smart to be happy, the flattering excuse he would gladly accept. It is that he is smart enough to be happy and has chosen over and over to spend that intelligence building reasons not to try, and that the only moments he is ever close to whole are the ones he sets the genius down and simply stays. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.